Ask your average country boy or girl what they think of socialism and you'll get all sorts of negative answers, comparing it to Stalin, Mao, or Hitler even. As most people don't understand the differences between socialism, communism, and Nazism, just that many nations who claim the title were totalitarian regimes, just like how North Korea is officially called the Democratic Republic of Korea, and therefore both democracy and republicanism is obviously horrible. Sadly, the people who benefit most from socialism have been convinced it's the worst thing in the world, even though the hollowing out of the US socialist systems made rural economies unviable and unsustainable. Rural regions have always been rough places to live. They take a lot of work to survive and thrive. No question about it. Rural people are hardworking and have to put up with inconveniences and make sacrifices that most city dwellers don't have to. Unfortunately, because of this, the rugged individual myth has spread throughout the rural region, and the belief that it was just their hard work that allowed them to thrive or fail has propagated. Contrary to popular perception, a form of government intervention and spending throughout the entirety of the US is the only thing that ensured the middle-class rural regions could even exist. Government spending on roads, locks, and other modes of transporting goods was the first form of wealth redistribution under John Adams to James Monroe. This allowed farmers' goods to reach cities and foreign markets that would have just ended up having to be sold to fellow farmers, or the price of transport would have to be so high they couldn't be competitive. This fed the cities and drove the trade profits all over the country. Next, the removal of native peoples and homesteading was a free government giveaway and subsidy on a mass scale. Sadly, the inhabitants didn't have a say in the removal. Most of the land owned by modern white people wouldn't even have existed if not for violent native removal and homesteading. Not the best example of the goodness of government handouts, but it made America what it is. The railroad used government grants that connected the east to the west coast, allowing rural regions even more access to other markets for their goods. They also standardized the system, creating time zones and weights and measures for better standardization. Any company that had a government contract had to make all patents open source, which essentially caused a massive government-funded tech boom leading to the Second Industrial Revolution. This started with designing rifles and replaceable parts, which led to sewing machines, bicycles, and beyond. The Replaceable Standardized Parts Project was very near and dear to Thomas Jefferson, and it took 50 to 75 years of government spending, with mostly failures, that we all benefited from. Without these government contracts, the Second Industrial Revolution may have taken 50 to 100 years more, or another government in another country may have succeeded with their spending, putting America at a massive disadvantage. This, of course, led to the trusts, monopolies, monopsonies, which is a single buyer of goods, in this case labor, and of course, the century-long banned corporations. This led to abuse of workers and widespread buying of public officials so that the only spending the government did was for corporations while denouncing government spending on people. We know of this era as the Gilded Age, the nation's era of the most income inequality between rich and free poor the nation had ever seen, all thanks to the power that technology gave over laborers. Teddy Roosevelt and Taft began pushing for the movement to break up big trusts and monopolies, which gave unions some breathing room to actually form and gain political power. From 1900 to 1950, socialism and communism actually gained a lot of prominence in the US, and people weren't being persecuted or treated as terrible people so much, or weird for these political stances, especially in the rural regions where communism and socialism were just another political philosophy. The writer of the Pledge of Allegiance was a socialist pastor, and Woody Guthrie, the writer of This Land Is My Land, was an ardent communist, but distinctly American libertarian communist, who believed, like Marx, in the rule of law, the Bill of Rights, and true democracy, and that communist was a political party to add to the debate, not the only way to think. Sadly, Marx took this as a given, and didn't distinctly put this in the manifesto, though wrote about it later, and instead of using the new electable Duma parliament after the February Revolution to try and get communists fairly elected, instead Lenin had a bloody coup that October, and created the first totalitarian communist state, which went entirely counter to what Marx wanted in the first place. Marx was of course at this time dead and could not speak out against this horrible thing done in his name either. Both the communist countries and the West both insisted on calling it communism because it helped benefit them. For the Soviets, they were hoping to get the backing of the world's working peoples, and the West wanted to use it to denigrate communism in general. Stalin pushed out Trotsky, Lenin's successor, who was no saint either, and made it even more totalitarian and brutal, and began funding and pushing propaganda for Marxist-Leninism, this weird hybrid of Marxism that defeated much of the purpose of Marx's points entirely. During this time, especially during the Depression, union membership skyrocketed and reached an all-time high. They used strategies such as wildcat strikes, where if a group in the company has a grief or complaint, they could strike and mess up the supply chain, ensuring they were heard, as well as secondary boycotts, where not only would they tell people to boycott their company, but also boycott companies that sold their company's products. Union families were fiercely loyal, and this worked very well. FDR finally passed the Wagner Act that defended people's rights to unionize by vote, and through workplace democracy would require all people working at a company with a union to be part of said union, as they would be getting the benefits, even if they didn't want to participate. Returning from war, labor lost a lot of footing, especially with the Cold War rising and the Red Scare. Taft-Hartley weakened unions massively and became an elite club that only 1/3 of the nation was part of. In the advent of Eisenhower getting elected and the rise of the Cold War, America inadvertently became more socialist, especially in rural regions. Lots of investment in free education, infrastructure, and science skyrocketed as it was felt it was needed to defeat the commies. Well-maintained roads and highways made it logistically viable to have lots of jobs and factories spread all over the nation, along with specific incentives to ensure that factories were well concentrated throughout the nation, so there would be backup factories if there was an invasion or city was nuked. Highways were brand new to the nation in the 50s and were part of national defense and were created as an escape route and had stretches that the military could land aircraft on in case of invasion or emergency. The government also created farm insurance and subsidies that protected farmers from the natural boom-bust cycle of farming. The country changed dramatically from a bunch of poor subsidy farmers and coal miners to some very well-to-do middle-class farmers, coal miners, and factory workers that created a vibrant middle class. There was no competition from overseas, as all the industrial power had been blown to bits, so this added even more prosperity to capitalism. So when unions demanded more money, the capitalists didn't fight nearly as much as they would have to keep their stagnant, limping form of unions as they would have if the U.S. didn't hold a worldwide monopoly on commerce. From the 20s to the 70s, former slaves moved from the rural South to the inner city, where a lot of industry, especially meat packing and slaughterhouses, were located. They, for the first time ever, made a decent living and had thriving communities. But with all this new logistics and incentives in the 50s and 60s, many of the jobs moved to the rural regions. As they owned houses in neighborhoods that were suddenly near worthless, that was meant to have been an investment with a mortgage that was way higher than those given to whites thanks to racial discrimination and redlining, the inner city ghettos and poverty arose. Drug use and hopelessness spiked, with no real good way out and no hope of good jobs ever returning. And welfare wasn't available to blacks like it was whites. Until during the 70s, black women had to fight just to get the same access to welfare that white women had. This frustration fueled the civil rights movement and sadly the race riots. Since Woodrow Wilson, the South had always been pro-Democratic Party. Once Johnson signed in the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, no Democratic president won the South again, and the South ate up the party line of the anti-socialist rhetoric, hook, line, and sinker. During the 70s, a former actor and governor of California began spreading around propaganda against the scourge of socialized healthcare, which Nixon was in favor of at the time. But Reagan's propaganda created the weird HMOs that existed until the ACA, which was exactly the plan Nixon was trying to pass at the time. On top of this, from the 20s to the 50s, some companies began paying preachers, because they were viewed as more trustworthy, to begin preaching Jesus and capitalism as mutually exclusive. And with an advent of radio, it worked over time. As communist nations were enforced atheists, obviously the only other option a good Christian could believe in was capitalism, and it ended up sticking, as Billy Graham, a famous pro-capitalist pastor, had the ear of all the presidents until George W. Bush. And it was at this point that the religious right began to form, with the insulation that being rural provides. And as religious as they are in rural regions, the spread of Republican anti-socialist ideas spread like wildfire. Reagan spoke out strongly against Johnson's Great Society in certain unions, but he was for maintaining the work of Eisenhower and the New Deal. He won on a platform of inherent distrust against the government, and welfare queen became a new dog whistle for black, as they couldn't be directly racist anymore and win, as prior to black women getting welfare, most whites were all for it. But once blacks started getting it, it became evil. Reagan won and stripped unions of certain rights, lowered taxes on the rich to a level that hadn't existed since the Depression era, and began denigrating and tapping Social Security, which is why people now view it as non-viable. Bush followed, and with constant Democratic losses thanks to this extreme conservatism in the name of the distrust of government and American values bolstered by the new religious right, Bill Clinton had to become a bit more moderate just to win, and once Newt Gingrich came to power in the House, Reagan had opened up an Overton's window, and Gingrich pushed it even further. Clinton and Gingrich negotiated. Clinton got increased taxes on the rich and better protections for women. Gingrich got less banking regulations, repealing Glass-Steagall, stripping of welfare as we all assume it is, but hasn't been since the 90s, along with harsher prisons. They both got a plan passed to eliminate the debt by 2012. NAFTA and the opening of China, and even more so automation, made higher education a necessity, but as the Cold War declined, the defense argument for funding education declined. As student loans were deregulated and the government refused to negotiate down costs for these artificially created customers for college, the price of college shot up exponentially. If we instead just paid for college and forced the prices down through negotiations, like most other nations do, conservative estimates show that it would cost the same amount as if all the grants and work-study programs we currently spend now, because all the means testing and middlemen would be eliminated. Also, data shows that through the GI Bill, that all money paid on higher education by the government actually pays itself back and more by bumping people up into a higher tax bracket and keeps people out of prison and keeps them healthier. The Overton window of what was acceptable moved again, and under the W. Bush administration, we went to 2 badly run wars with no-bid contracts, doubling the debt, increased bank deregulations, borrow and spending, increased privatization, and insanely increased surveillance. Also during his presidency, Fox News arose, spreading misinformation, anger, and fear, pretending to be news by keeping the trappings of a news studio, but keeping only 1 hour in a 24-hour period of actual journalistic news. Elderly people, especially who had been taught to trust TV, along with people out in the rural regions, bought into this lock, stock, and barrel, and they listened to Rush Limbaugh, who pretended to be one of them in spite of making millions, and helped to convince people that socialism was communism, was Nazism, and Democrats were all socialists. Even country music became more conservative over time. Johnny Cash demanded union workers for his sets, and the overall lauding of unions and hard work as well as prison reform. Country music was overall bipartisan, with some artists more on the left or on the right. It wasn't until the mid-90s came around that a strong conservative bias began to taint country music from a liberal to moderate message of appreciating the hard-working poor and the honor of not having much, to a very materialistic Christian conservative country music that took over in the 2000s. In 2007, Ron Paul and libertarianism became a big hit with the young people of the internet, mostly because they were unaware of the dog whistle language used, and it was the socialist movement that started libertarianism, but it got co-opted in the US by some wealthy anti-union John Birchers and made freedom their buzzword for ending any regulation that was used to protect the workers and citizens from being exploited or poisoned in the pursuit of gain. Ron Paul threw in legal weed and gay marriage, and young guys ate it up. From his movement, the Tea Party came about, with Obama winning. The Tea Party morphed into a group for the religious right and racists, depending on which of the 5 organizations you belong to. All of this misinformation about socialism had reached its peak, and in 2010, in a redistricting year, whether you hated Obama for being supposedly socialist, communist, Nazi, Muslim, or because he was black, Republicans, especially in rural regions, swept the ballot box in House, Senate, and state governments, while Democrats stayed home because Obama wasn't the socialist messiah and peacenik they thought he was. This allowed the Republicans to begin to redistrict in what is called Red Map, where they used statistical GIS data never available to anyone before and gerrymandered to a point that was beyond crazy, in many states deliberately racist. Democrats used to be the most notorious at gerrymandering, but the impacts of the new data-driven method was beyond that. It is estimated that based on numbers of voters for each candidate, if equally represented, liberals would have 18 more House members in Congress just because of gerrymandering, and let's not even get started on state governments. This created more right-to-work states, killing even more power of the unions. The supposedly socialist ACA, or Obamacare, became a rallying point and a bludgeon for Republicans, especially poor ones, even though it helped them more than they ever knew until Trump won and tried to destroy it, and they suddenly realized that they would possibly die without it. With the end of the Cold War, suddenly the need for subsidies to distribute manufacturing and create redundancies went away. NAFTA, China, and automation killed jobs all over the nation, while lawmakers stopped spending on infrastructure, science, and education, once funded as part of national defense. So the only places with sufficiently educated people and reliable infrastructure were now cities. So the jobs that replaced old rural and small town, well-paying jobs over the last 3 decades all concentrated in cities, and created a rural version of the inner city ghetto, just way less population dense, but no less nihilistic or hopeless, with higher crimes per person than in many city neighborhoods, and a lot of drug use and opioid overdoses. With the weakened regulations on drug manufacturers, drug companies used bad data to claim that many of these opioids were not addictive and became drug pushers through high-pressure medical sales, plunging millions into opioid addiction who would have never thought of using drugs before. This hopelessness and nihilism is what led to the resurgence in racism in the US and the ultimate vote for Trump. The inner city has now replaced the small-town middle class and vice versa. Rent in the inner city is now higher than a cat's back, and where educated, high-paying young professionals choose to live before they decide to have kids and move to the suburbs. Every single problem the rural economy and small towns face are not directly caused by capitalism, but from the stripping out of socialism the government decided was acceptable from the 40s to the 70s, and then began slashing from the 80s to the 2000s. Small-town airport funding and roads and bridges are all on the chopping block. Hamstringing of post offices so they can't compete with UPS and FedEx like they easily would without congressional sabotage, as the post office is some rural people's only lifeline to the outside world, is what many Republicans want. Education payments that states used to help students out with, so that when they graduated they could easily pay off their loans in 1 to 3 years max, went away, and now massive student debt is the only method of getting a higher education for many people. Also, a lack of innovation for rural areas such as inexpensive high-speed internet, which 10 to 25% of Americans don't have either, because it's too expensive or there is no physical way to get internet. No longer just a place to watch cat videos and porn, reliable internet is now required if you want to sell your product to people who have never heard of you, homework help, and seeking any job. The Constitution calls for post roads because Jefferson and Franklin believed only the free flow of information would allow for a population educated enough to make democracy work. By that token, post offices should be in charge of running the internet cables, like they do in every other nation, and get to pay 1/10 of the amount that we do, because they easily just lay cable cheaply anytime they have infrastructure maintenance. Then multiple internet providers can compete to take care of the software end of things. A non-profit co-op for these services is an alternative that Chattanooga, Tennessee was able to pull off, which now boasts one of the fastest internet systems in America. But thanks to the Gilded Age we live in, Comcast spends the most on lobbying of any company in Washington, reinforcing laws to prevent these co-ops from being able to form. From this gap in information, snake oil salesmen have filled in the gaps, spreading fear in rural regions, such as a movement of people going around to rural regions selling books and fear about Sharia law taking over the country. Islam at the moment makes up 1% of the nation. By 2050, it is projected to be 2% of the nation. So it is mathematically impossible for Sharia law to take over unless no non-Muslims vote. But as these people are the only ones that people in isolated areas hear from, it's the only point of view they get. Of course, the GOP war on socialism doesn't include the biggest companies. Solar and wind, which can be implemented easily on local level for decades, couldn't compete with unfair coal and oil subsidies, and farm tax breaks and aid that were meant for what is now small and mid-sized farms are now being used by massive farms that are corporately owned by Wall Street execs who have no roots in the rural areas. Limiting subsidies and tax breaks to small and mid-sized businesses would help the actual rural folk have more control over their lives, as many of the rural folk can no longer afford a farm and big business owns all the jobs. While country folk can survive without big government, they can't thrive in the middle class without it. All good-paying jobs require further education, and most kids who leave the rural or small-town regions often never return because there's no future there for them. just like me. Without federal government subsidies and incentives, small-town airports, electric lines, postal service, libraries, and telephones would not exist, or the price would have been so exorbitant that only a handful of people in these areas would have access to them, as there is not enough incentive for free market capitalism alone to bring in that technology and build that infrastructure. Most of these systems operate at a loss in small towns and rural areas, paid for by government subsidies or charging the urban areas a bit more than they would normally be fair, spreading the expense across to everyone. The same is true with taxes, as people most afraid of big government and federal taxes are usually rural and small town folk who literally pay the least into federal government and get the most out of it. And many people living hopelessly in rural areas are stuck there, as they sunk their livelihoods into their houses and the work dried up, and now they have to lose everything or remain hopelessly stagnant, much like the plight of the inner city ghettos. Americans are moving at half the rate they did 50 years ago, meaning people aren't getting the best prices available for their labor, and there are labor shortages in many fields, even though the nation overall might have plenty of skilled people, though most companies refuse to invest in education for more workers like they used to. Moving now can also cost thousands because of all the stuff we own, and we can either get rid of all that stuff or stay stuck. One way to fix for this labor mismatch is to allow for federal tax credits to help people move in hopes of finding a better job. But once again, that would be socialism. Retraining is another. Part of the coal country plan involves providing education for much needed jobs in coding and programming, while Republicans have recently slashed that and instead promised to return to a coal boom, even though no one wants coal because it's such an awful substance to burn just in terms of pollution that makes medical bills higher, and natural gas is now cheaper and more efficient, and most of it is automated by robots. However, even 100% paid for retraining wouldn't be even close enough. People still have to live during school, and then once they get into their new field, they have to start at the bottoms. So you have 50 years old that lost their $30 an hour job, having to work for $15 an hour. That's freedom in the free market, according to conservatives who hate socialism. New small business has shrunk by around half since the 1980s. Small business owners feel like they're third world street vendors more than small businesses in first world nations, as they do have to pay higher taxes on their business, while wealthy companies hire expensive lawyers to take advantage of tax breaks and loopholes to have to pay nothing at all. It's why when Trump says we have the highest tax rate, he's telling the truth but lying about what he means, as most large companies never pay that tax rate thanks to all the loopholes. Fixing these loopholes would allow us to drop the overall tax rate, which did happen under Reagan, but were later put back into the tax code. It's why back in the day, you hope to run a business all your life and enrich your community, then want to sell it off to a company broker like Alphabet or a drug company and just get the money. This is what the war on socialism that fills in the natural gaps of capitalism that both Adam Smith and Marx worried about and warned about has done to us all over the nation, and now it's hit the rural regions the worst. The base of the anti-socialist Republican Party or libertarians. They blame immigrants, Muslims, minority, PCism, regulation, and globalism for every single one of their problems that are caused by the Republican war on socialism. The rural regions having once been the hotbed of socialism in America. They promised to take us back to a time that was an abnormality in human history, not a norm, where people could have a job they worked at the rest of their life with a pension. This only worked because of strong unions, and every other industrialized nation had been crushed by World War II. As other nations began to rebuild and new technology and logistics advanced, the monopoly began to die, and other nations became better at making certain things than the US did. These jobs will never come back, and we need to focus on what we are good at and invest in education at all levels to be ready for the next round of changes that will come, without saddling everyone with massive student debt just to survive in this economy. We need to reclaim this land for our own, from the moneyed elites, and rebuild all America and make it great again like we did in the 50s to the 70s, where we spent the most ever, and upward mobility in the US was the best the world had ever seen. We built the most educated, most scientific, most powerful nation leading the world, all in the name of defense. But was all in all a form of socialism that helped everyone in America. We need to get rid of the Taft-Hartley Act, and all workplaces should be unionized, or even better, end corporations like our founding fathers wanted, and give businesses that are no longer family owned and run to the employees as co-ops to be run by democracy as opposed to authoritarianism with uneven labor negotiations that our founding fathers would find so appalling. Or we need to create a universal basic income of some kind as more and more jobs get automated to ensure that everyone can survive automation, an idea promoted by Thomas Paine, one of the founders, as well as right-wing economist Milton Friedman and people on all sides of the political spectrum. With an aging population, people who take care of the elderly barely get paid enough. Perhaps we can have a form of community service as a caveat to receive universal income, as industrial jobs for workers die, but human interaction can never be replaced by robots. In our current market system, there is no room for financially valuing this kind of job in a fashion that allows people to survive financially. Bill Gates has recommended an automation tax to pay for guaranteed basic income so that companies will think twice about replacing their workers with automation, ensuring the benefits of automation will truly outweigh the extra taxes for automating. And the people getting laid off can still benefit from automation, as the underlying science research that made that automation possible was spent almost entirely by the US government using our tax money decades ago. We are also beginning to rapidly fall behind China in science research, which will hurt us in decades to come, as the next laser, computer, and spacecraft that changed the last half of the decade, without science spending, China will have all that tech. Though without proper spending on cybersecurity, they will have anything we discover anyway, as they already steal around $10 billion in tech research yearly. Rural folks themselves are Americans whose ancestors were the very first US socialists and benefited massively from socialism that moved their life of rural and small town living from poor to middle class and then back to poor, and are now dealing with an opioid crisis from the Republican War on Socialism. We must all understand this history that has been wiped from many in America. These ancestors forgotten in the American mind, who pulled themselves up not by their rugged individualist bootstraps, but by banding together and unionizing in the face of violence, devastating poverty, or even death or massacre, should be heroes to us all. But instead, everything they stood for and hoped for had been denigrated as evil. Socialism is as American as apple pie and the backbone of all rural economies that thrive. Without a good infrastructure, education, and incentives, there is no free market force strong enough to bother working outside a population-dense area en masse. Socialism fills in the problems of capitalism pointed out by Adam Smith, way back in the 1700s. We need to stop thinking of economic models like capitalism and socialism as dogmas we must follow, but instead treat them as tools to get the most social good out of. Things like basic science infrastructure, both mental and physical, and emergency-based services like healthcare have been shown repeatedly to spread the most good throughout a government-based system, while issues like engineering and innovation are best distributed and funded by a free market system. America as we know it was built on a partnership of socialism and capitalism, and if we want to get back to that nation we once knew, we must once again embrace it as our rural ancestors did, before their hubris and Republican fear-mongering make them forget their heritage.